Go ahead.
When we are living as Christians and trying to address these issues as they occur in our community,
Yes.
it would be easy to write something or say something that would sound very hateful.
Correct.
And that's, you want to stand up for God. You don't want to make God look like hateful.
Correct.
So what do you do?
So it's a great question, and this is that I actually think is the fundamental question for the church in our era. You talk about the cyclical nature of society, and I actually think the church has arrived at a unique point in history where we're going to kind of prove our mettle. Here's what I think we do. If we follow Schaeffer's pattern, how did we get here? Philosophy, art, music, TV, movies, all that type of stuff. That's how we got here. It's not as though nihilists stood up and logically convinced people to embrace nihilism. They told stories and narratives and drew art and wrote music and performed plays, and that what they did, I don't know how to put this because there's a lot tied up with it, but I'm going to use terms and language that people may not be familiar with for a while. I'm sorry if you're not. Protestant Christianity has been so caught up with left hemisphere ideas. Let me proclaim abstract concepts out in the universe. Here's the categories. Here's theology. Here are the 10 aspects of systematic theology. Learn about that, learn about that, learn about that. Like I was talking about in the sermon, we're hitting the head, we're hitting the head, we're hitting the head. Information, 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 information. That's why we've lost. Because the culture and society didn't hit us with pure information. There was a little bit sprinkled in there, but they hit us with narratives. They hit us with stories. They hit us with music. They hit us with art. They subversively wove their way into the culture, and it began to permeate and spread that way. I think the way forward for the church is to be subversive. I think we really need to up our game as Christians when it comes to art, music, television shows, movies, story, communities, and it's not as though, so you might be sitting there and going, well, I'm not a video producer, what do I do? No, you tell a story with your own life as well. You engage with people in community. So I want to escape the right hemisphere trap that we've put ourselves in as Protestant Christians, and I want to migrate to the left hemisphere trap, and I want to migrate to the right hemisphere, which is all about the wholeness of the world and God's world, and it's not these just logical, intellectual, scientific propositions. We've too long just emphasized that, and consequently, the only people who have come to Christ are people who are convinced by the arguments, right? So who are people who have done right-brain Christianity well? C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, right? Now, you don't have to write these grand epics and narratives and poems, etc., but the Inklings were doing something to take the most intellectual, sophisticated, and philosophical people of their day and saying essentially this: do you want to embrace the realness of the world? Christianity is where it's at. Do you want to embrace real intellectualism and real poetry and real art? Christianity is where it's at. And it became something, at least in their little sub-community, that was so compelling, so motivating, so encouraging that people were like, I can't help but buy into this. So where am I going with all this? We need to be doing the same things, I think, in Protestant circles. Protestantism is unfortunately bound up a little bit with the whole Enlightenment movement. There's a reason that Protestantism kicked off with the printing press, with Luther, and all of that. And a lot of it was tied together with Enlightenment theory, right? Don't get me wrong. I love that for laying a foundation. We have laid a Protestant foundation that is firm, sola scriptura. You can't do without that. But we've laid it. The foundation has been laid. We understand sola scriptura. Now we need to build on the foundation with powerful metaphors and stories and ideas and concepts that grip people's hearts instead of just speaking to their heads. And so how do you do that practically in your life? That looks like living out your little Christian narrative in your bubble well before your neighbors, families, and friends. That looks like them going, wow, they're so hospitable, they're so benevolent, they're so generous, etc. Maybe their Christianity has to do with that, right? That's a piece of it. But it goes more than that. Again, a lot of the stories and narratives we tell are not only with just our lives, but they're also the music we listen to, the TV shows we watch, the movies we watch, how we talk about and conceptualize all of these things. All of those things need to be much more integrated into the Protestant mind, if that makes sense. Because for so long, the Protestant mind has only focused on the left hemisphere. And I think now, and it worked, right? Because what else focuses on the left hemisphere? Philosophy, rationalism, science. All of those are left hemisphere ideas for the most part. And so what Protestantism was religion for the thinking man, right? And you could talk, we've got theology, we've got doctrine, etc., all of those things. But what have we done? We've gone through rationalism and enlightenment. It's done. Postmodernism came out of it. Postmodernism, in that sense, is almost an ally of Christianity because it shows the pointlessness of building your system purely on science, rationality, and philosophy. So we realize that that's a waste of time. But what does postmodernism leave in its wake? Nothing. Nihilism, right? So what we need to do is the goal of postmodernism couldn't be realized because it's a self-refuting proposition, right? I know that there's no such thing as absolute truth. Is that absolutely true? Well, you're already stuck, right? So that's where postmodernism ends up. That's where Christianity needs to come in and fill the gap. We need to fill the vacuum that postmodernism has left. Postmodernism did the work we needed it to do. It destroyed rationalism, enlightenment, scientism. It's so funny, I run across atheists online now. Well, science proves everything, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, you're 50 years behind the curve, bro. Like, you don't even know how much this is out of vogue. Like, if you were in the know in terms of what's popular today, atheism based on pure scientism and stuff like that is gone. Nobody cares about that right now. Right now, what's going on in philosophy is postmodernism, and it's left this giant vacuum that if Protestantism will embrace its right hemisphere, can come in and fill the void. And so that's what we need to do. So the way I'll do it in my little way, I'm going to try to use more pictures, more stories, more metaphors. I don't know how many times in the sermon you probably, a ship without a rudder, right? Like I'm trying to I'm very left hemisphere. I'm an engineer, right? But I realize we need to be very right hemisphere in our approach, and I'm trying to inject that more and more in my preaching because it captures the heart, it captures the mind, it draws you into the narrative, into the story. I don't know if any of that made sense, but there you go. Yeah, go ahead.
And I think too, like the more of a full-fledged approach like that you can present of this is what the biblical worldview means, this is how it's lived out, you can almost like combat the idea that, Christianity is hateful and God is just a hateful entity of a law-giving ruler who dominates and takes my fun away, or however you want to reduce him, because I've talked to a lot of people who say, when I've looked at the Bible, all I see is a God who promotes genocide and exclusivity. And you're like, well, you're just looking at certain data points outside of context.
Correct.
And that's not even how you do good science. So if we can show people's story of why do you think God did that? Let me show you. Let me walk you through where this is coming from, the personality of God, and then I can show you how I'm trying to live that out. Then you almost can convey like the balance of, no, this is a loving God. This is a just God. There is a system and a reason for those choices. And it can kind of take away that reductionistic idea of Christianity is just a hateful faith, you know. But it takes time and actual dialogue and intentionality to show that full-fledged, multifaceted, representation of what it means to be a Christ follower.
Right.
And I think the hard part in our society right now is outside of doing life on life with people, it's really difficult to have the space for those kinds of conversations. That kind of intimate, open conversation,
Yeah.
We kind of do everything at a fast food pace, and that's the challenge. And it's like no wonder a lot of people's takeaway of Jesus is this like slapdash, elevator pitch gospel that doesn't feel very loving. It doesn't feel very powerful. It feels fairly manipulative, honestly. Like you have an agenda and you're just trying to put a notch in your belt that you converted somebody. And I think that's unfortunate because just like Tolkien and Lewis have demonstrated, some of the richest storytelling, the most thought-provoking ideas, the most beautiful narratives come from a biblical worldview, but that takes time to share.
Correct. And our approach isn't transformative. And that's what we want is transformation. And in order for people to be transformed, they need the Holy Spirit working on their hearts and lives, but that is often done through a narrative or a story. There's a reason that Jesus spoke in almost purely parables during his ministry, right? So effective, so powerful, you know. And I think we need to get into that that mode of thinking. Now, don't get me wrong. I will never abandon the firm foundation of the Scriptures, sola scriptura, tota scriptura, etc. This is the foundation we move from, but we take all of the principles and ideas in here and we put it in the context of a narrative of people's lived lives that they can see and wrestle with and grapple with. And I think we need to explore more how we can implement the ideas of like Tolkien and Lewis in our current day and age, our current culture and society, because that's how we lost the culture. That's how the culture has ended up where it's at right now. That's why we're nihilistic now. That's why 50% of people have, mental struggles and disorders and depression and anxiety, etc. That's why. That's how we lost the culture. That's how we recapture the culture, is through narrative, story, art, on and on and on you go. And again, it's multiplied in it can be as simple as a man without purpose is like a ship without a rudder. That's a story. That's a metaphor. That it grips the heart. It grabs the attention. That's how Jesus spoke. Like sometimes he would preach a sermon that had almost no propositional content to it. It was just story after story after story after story. A man went down to here. A person went over there. A kid went over here. And you're just, Jesus, what does it all mean? And he's grabbing people where it matters, right? And for years in Protestantism, we refuse to engage people where it matters. And I think that's why we find ourselves in our current situation. But there's a vacuum right now left by postmodernism that we can fill if we will rush in there with narrative that displays God's truth. That's the key. So it's going to be a complicated endeavor, but I believe that's the role of the church right now in history. Go ahead.
What we need to do, I think, it's like, give me an example.
Yes.
Jesus, you can say all these big words, and the person say, okay, I hear the word, what does that mean exactly,
Yes.
And it's our oral tradition, the way that people kept their roots and everything else is that they would have storytelling.
That's right.
And that's where you engage the people. I mean, if you tell, like Les Miserables, you have that guy that was a crook and all this other kind of stuff, and by being shown by a Christian, that they were willing to give things up without punishing the person, it changed him completely.
Right.
And then you follow the story
Right.
of his life.
It's like a Raskolnikov. I only told a little bit of it. That's like a 1,000-page book, by the way. I tried to summarize a 1,000-page book. But that is what's happening in Crime and Punishment. Dostoevsky didn't come out and say, you nihilists are wrong. Let me give you 15 philosophical points about why. Instead, he placed a nihilist in his story and followed him on his journey of self-discovery and demonstrated through narrative that nihilism doesn't work. And it's more compelling, more long-lasting, more impactful than all of their philosophical, convolutedness combined. Now, let me translate this into the religious sphere. Protestants look more like the nihilist philosophers in their execution, right? Here's an idea, here's a proposition. Justification by faith alone, right? Sanctification is a synergistic process between God and man. Salvation is through monergism only. And this is the foundation I've laid. This is the study and the research I've done, but that doesn't grab people, it doesn't drive people, it doesn't motivate people. Dostoevsky, by contrast, is functioning like Jesus does, which is what we should be doing, and that's the role we need to fill in with. Again, never abandoning the solid theological foundations on which we've stood, but we've treated these as an end, the theological foundations, instead of the means to the end, and the means to the end is an encounter with Jesus Christ himself, transformation into a disciple of his, right? And we need to follow that path, and we do that through story and through narrative. So I agree with you 100%, and that's what we need to be doing in all areas and facets of life. I'm going to get into this in a lot more detail when we do our LGBT conference. The LGBT conference is almost going to be exclusively about this idea, because that's how we ended up with this narrative that LGBT, my body, my choice, I do whatever I want, etc. It all comes from the same stuff, right? That's where it all came from. And so when we do the LGBT conference, I hope to walk through the different types of stories, narratives, ideas that capture our hearts as human beings, and talk about how we can subversively use them in a Christian way. That's what we need to be doing, right? We need spies in their networks. Man, I just love that movie, and it's just permeated with Christian themes. Man, I loved what they said about such and such, right? And it's just full and permeated with Christian themes. They can't escape it, right? So that's the path forward, I think. Go ahead.
To add on all of that, I think it's only fair to say we have to have the theology that we're standing on, because there are Christian movies that are coming out now that sometimes I'm watching and I'm like, you could have done so much better by changing those 4 lines that you did and making that really, really biblically sound, and you just made it a little bit too wishy-washy.
That's right.
So we do have to be careful as we're permeating the culture to, as Christians, know the theology and know the foundation so well, so that what we're sharing through art and media is
I agree.
spot on.
I actually agree 100%, and I'll give you an example of this. There's a pastor I really respect on YouTube, and I got on one of his Q&As, and I asked him a question, left hemisphere versus right hemisphere, and I basically said, Protestantism has been so tied up with the left hemisphere. How can we focus more on the right hemisphere and telling good stories and narratives, and he just started laughing hysterically. And he goes, there are tons of right hemisphere Protestants. Have you ever heard of the charismatic movement? And I was like, oh, it was like in that moment I only realized, no, there have been but here's why I didn't even count them, because they're not in your standard creeds or confessions or etc. When I say Protestant, I'm thinking, Reformed Baptist, Presbyterian, these confessional Protestant movements that are grounded in the Protestant Reformation itself. But you have so many of these movements that have abandoned the left hemisphere entirely and just been like, yeah, let's do plays and let's do music and and too often the moral of the story, the narrative that they're pushing, doesn't line quite up with the biblical themes we want people to, and that's why I think they're more susceptible to things like progressive Christianity and other stuff like that, because that solid foundation hasn't been laid, right? And so when he told me that, I was like, wow, you're so right. And we've just essentially segmented all of our right hemisphere Christians off in one area and not giving them any, theological guidance, instruction, doctrine, theology, whatever. And no wonder they're running off doing their own thing, So it's like, wow. Striking the balance and getting both in their proper orientation is not easy, that's for sure. And so it's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, go ahead.